that will be on the agenda, that will be part of the discussion. What is missing, in my opinion, is a continuing resolve to be able to demand and take the authority that we are due as citizens of the United States of America. You know, we don't have a congresswoman who can vote. We don't have any senators, yet we pay the same taxes, don't we? Nobody said we're exempt from paying federal taxes. As a matter of fact, somebody suggested that to me once. Why don't you go for what Puerto Rico has? Why don't you be exempt from federal taxes? I said, I don't want to do that. I said, the moment that we do that, we will have cashed in our right to have a membership card in the United States of America. So I will pay my taxes, but just give me what I should get when I pay my taxes. And that is being a full-fledged citizen of the United States of America. What better group to take this on than the Humanities Council as you talk about the celebration of the existence of the District of Columbia, which should cease to be a district and become the state of New Columbia. Thank you all very much and enjoy your evening.
I'd next like to introduce our Director of Development and Communications, Mercedes Diane Forrest-Griffin.
Hello everyone, welcome. I'm so happy to see such a large turnout tonight. Oh my God, it's amazing. Are you all excited to celebrate the 225th anniversary? Yeah, right? Awesome. We hope you enjoyed the panel that we prepared for you tonight. My main purpose as the Humanitini's Director of Development and Communications is to make sure that I increase awareness of the organization and the work that we do, garner support so that we can continue to grow and develop as we push forward our mission. All of you have on your table donation cards. I'm asking that you look at them, fill them out. Whatever you can do is more than I can expect, because we want everyone to give what they can give. Drops in the bucket make a tsunami. So it all helps. Also, we are doing a great raffle tonight. One of our sponsors, DC Brown, has given us a great swag bag. It has a 64-ounce growler. It has a really nice winter scarf. It has two crystal glasses that you can use when you want to drink beer at home. The growler you can take to any facility that can fill it up. As I mentioned, it's 64 ounces, which is quite a lot. As you know, beer is very expensive. We're only raffling the bags off for $5. It also has a few other small items, so I would suggest that if you think this is something that you would like to have, or if you just want to support a great organization that's doing great work, please see our staff in the back and get a $5 raffle ticket. We will be offering the raffle tonight. I would say we're going to give about 15-20 minutes for people to trickle back, and when we get a nice break in the panel, I'll come back up and I will announce the winner. You'll see me with my phone in hand all night because I'm tweeting and Instagramming, so don't be nervous and wondering why is she constantly on her phone. I'm not texting Mommy, I'm actually working, so I just want to make sure you know that. And again, thank you all for coming out.
Thank you, Diane. Before I forget, I want to introduce the staff in the back who are a vital part of the organization. To my left and your right is Jasper Collier, the curator of our digital museum, and to his left is Stephanie Scott, our office administrator, without whom we would be helpless. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of a couple of board members, and because I'm new to the organization, I apologize if I miss anyone, but in the far back, I see Bob Bremner, our chair. Thanks, Bob. And all the way in the front, I see Yolanda Oporto, who's also a member of our board. So thank you all for coming to. And Matthew, of course, I forgot to say that one of our participants tonight is a board member, Matthew Gilmore. So thank you, Matthew. Twice. Okay, so let me set the stage for tonight's Humanitini. We're talking again about the first 20 years of DC's existence. Some of you all may know that that the federal government originally was based in Philadelphia. So Matthew's going to explain at greater length how the transition occurred, but essentially the federal government was relocated to this area of Washington, D.C., when this area was little more than a series of tobacco plantations. There was a process involved, again, Matthew will explain, but D.C. was pretty much created out of the ground. And so to illustrate that, what I'm going to do is start with a 6-minute video, which was prepared by the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, depicting the first few years of DC's existence as the architects are actually mapping out the city. After that 6-minute intro, I'm going to ask the panelists to come up to the stage, and I'm going to introduce them one at a time, and then turn things over to our moderator, Dr. Sandra Jowers-Barber from the University of the District of Columbia Community College. So please bear with me. I hope this video works. We'll take a look.
If you want, I can give you a copy of the file.
And this is an introduction to the work we've been doing to visualize the city of Washington, D.C. as it was in 1814. Here is a current satellite image of Washington, D.C. showing the area at the center of the District of Columbia included in Pierre Charles L'Enfant's original plan of the city. Colored pins mark the location of key landmarks: the Capitol, the White House, the Washington Monument, and the Lincoln and Jefferson Memorials. Now watch as the image morphs into a topographic map by architect Donald Alexander Hawkins that depicts how the territory appeared to L'Enfant in March of 1791 when he arrived to begin his work. Note the dramatic differences in the shape of the land and the width of the Potomac River. Those few images of the early city that have survived until today were created mostly by untrained amateurs or professionals educated in the romantic landscape tradition. These artworks, full of optimism and imagination, usually fail to provide an accurate topography or the relative position of objects on the land. Is this really how the federal city appeared from Georgetown in the early 1800s? We might as well be looking at the Blue Ridge Mountains rather than the site of the young nation's capital. Early maps presented the city as finished and orderly. It was neither. The task of visualizing the nascent city has proved to be more challenging than we'd anticipated, not due to the limits of technology, but due to the sparseness of reliable historical evidence. Our first step was to create a base map, reflecting everything known about the city in the early 1800s. This map, based on cartography and scholarship by Don Hawkins, is keyed to a large database that we assembled of early Washington, D.C. paintings, drawings, and written references. For example, Q4, highlighted here, indicates the vantage point for an image sketched by John Reuben Smith in 1830. Scholars agree that the wooden cabins seen here are historically accurate. So is the fence, a security measure designed in part to keep cows out of the Capitol. To represent the rise and fall of the landscape, we relied on the work of USGS geographer Peter Chirico, who used detailed surveys from before and after the Civil War to create a large-scale 3D model of the landscape. Then, we adjusted that information using Hawkins's topographic reconstruction of the ground in 1790. This results in our best approximation of the contours of Washington, D.C. as they would have appeared more than 2 centuries ago. This survey drawing of the U.S. Capitol and its grounds, created by Benjamin Henry Latrobe, provided an exciting opportunity to recreate the original shape of Capitol Hill. Here we attempt to illustrate what Latrobe was able to see in his mind. Lines drawn in 2 dimensions come to life in 3. This eliminates the need for viewers to make sense of cartographic maps made using methods that, while elegant for their time, have now been obsolete for more than a century. Thanks to Latrobe's efforts, and thanks to the fact that his drawing survived, we can precisely visualize Capitol Hill in the year 1814. We're now ready to add simple models of documented structures to our terrain map. We affectionately call this our Monopoly building phase. After we've used the best available evidence to assemble our map and tentatively place buildings, we can double-check our work by comparing historical drawings from the time period against our recreated landscape. In this example, 2 seemingly incidental farm buildings in a sketch of the Capitol by Latrobe are shown to be aligned correctly to a much later and different viewpoint. This process of triangulation allows us to verify the location of buildings, roads, fields, fences, and other landscape elements. immersing us in a very different capital city than the one we experience today. Now, finally, the real fun and work can begin. In this rough composite sequence, our camera flies low to the ground, gliding along Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House down to the Capitol. It's a revelation. A national mall without museums or monuments, home to grazing animals and fields of wheat, corn, and tobacco. The Potomac River dominates the view, brown with silt and mud. The scene beyond the river is no generic stock background. The horizon line you see here truly reflects the location and appearance of hills, pastures, farm fields, and forests. Thanks to 4 years of work at UMBC's Imaging Research Center, more than 5,000 hours of labor in all, we can now generate a view of the infant capital city from any location we wish. Out of the tangled roots of cartography, historical scholarship, art history, and simple curiosity emerges a fleshed-out recreation of Washington as it was. Our digital artists can now put the final touches on a complete, fully rendered historical tableau. This animation is what we call a proof of concept, an attempt to visualize in as much detail as possible a single specific place and moment in Washington's early history. Here, then, is one finished piece of the historical puzzle, our best guess as to how the unfinished Capitol would have looked almost 2 centuries ago in the spring of 1814, just months before the building, as well as all of the priceless historical documentation within its walls, was burned by the British.
Okay, what we're going to do next is pause to do the raffle. So Diane, if you could come up.
Has everyone gotten their raffle ticket? You want to get a raffle ticket? Let me know. We're gonna have some time.
Okay, I guess we'll wait then a little bit longer. Okay, what I'd like to do next is introduce the panel. And I'm going to be very brief. I'm just going to tell people, I'm just going to tell you all everyone's name, and I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves at greater length. So first I have the honor of introducing Dr. Sandra Jowers-Barber, who is the chair or director of the Humanities program at the University of the District of Columbia Community College. Next to her left, is Matthew Gilmore, again a board member of HumanitiesDC and an expert in DC history of many years. To her right is Mark Sandalo, a professor at the University of California, District of Columbia Center. The District of Columbia Center for the University of California welcomes students from California universities to do internships in Washington, D.C. And Mark is a longtime journalist, teaches them that class while they're here in the district. And finally, to his right is Jose Suero, who is a member, or someone who works for the National Association of Hispanic Publications, also a journalist in many years, and well-connected in many other ways as well. So, if we're not going to do the raffle yet, I'm going to start off with Sandra.
Thank you very much, Jay. Good evening. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. And I'm going to say my name is Sandra. My mother is somewhere looking down saying, he did not say Sandra, did he? It's Sandra, but thank you very much. I am a historian as well by training. I am a public and oral historian. That means I believe in more history should be learned outside of the classroom than inside. That you can engage students and more people by actually going where historical actors have gone and seeing and being in places where historical events took place. I came to Washington straight out of high school from Atlantic City, New Jersey. I was the child that was going to Howard University before I was born, so there was no finding myself. My daddy would say, go in your room, sit down, prepare to go to Howard, that's where you're going. And I did. So I came to Washington and fell in love immediately. Freshman week, we went to Rock Creek Park. And I was walking across the rocks, fell into the water, and baptized, and I've been in love with Washington ever since. Found wings and teams on 14th and U, and that's it for me. I stayed. I love Atlantic City, but Washington is just such a wonderful place, and ideally situated between Atlantic City, so I can get back and forth. As a historian here in Washington and an educator, it's a perfect laboratory for our students to find out not only national and international history, but the beauty of local history. And that's what I enjoy most, making sure that our students who are native Washingtonians are aware of all of the historical events that have taken place and are currently going on in their city. And to help facilitate that is just such a joy. As now the director of the Humanities Division at the University of the District of Columbia Community College, I have the ability to shepherd through policy, and one of the things we're doing as we encourage our students and fulfill our vision of experiential learning is that all of the students get to do public history. I don't care what the discipline is, it's public history, because you're taking them out of the classroom and they're learning to apply what they learn in the classroom outside. So they're getting to see places where they normally would not go. So as we talk about the first 20 years, there will be some things that many of you will not know who may be native Washingtonians. But we can tie, and these gentlemen will be able to tie some of the things that happened in the first 20 years to what's going on now. The little film we saw was very nice, and I love technology. But as a public and oral historian, I want to talk about the people and what people from the ground up versus the top down. So we'll explore that as we talk more with you this evening.
My name is Matthew Gilmore. I came to Washington, D.C. from California. I went to UCLA, had lived other places in the country, came here for work. So I've been here 20-odd years now. When I got here, I got various ways sucked into doing research and work and helping people research DC history, and so I've just continued to do that even though I've kind of moved into other job arenas. So manage a discussion list and have a blog, and now run a history column for the In-Towner where I'm trying to take an interesting perspective on things, and so that's me.
I'm Mark Sangalo. I may have you guys beat today. I'm a DC native. I arrived here in 1959. I knew it was coming useful. My parents took me away when I was 6 months old, and it took 35 years to come back. So I wasn't raised here. But I have come back to DC. I was a journalist in San Francisco. The West Coast, if you are into food or natural beauty or diversity of people or weather, it's got DC beat on a lot of levels. But I've loved it here, and I've been here 23 years now, and I'm certainly not going back. Because of things we'll talk about. And I think the reason I was asked here is partly because this program, the University of California's Washington program, brings in about 1,000 Californians every year to experience Washington. Some of them intern at HumanitiesDC. And I get to see what these students think and see when they get to Washington. And maybe I can tie that in a little bit to what it was like when people first arrived a couple hundred years ago.
Okay, well, I wasn't here for the first 20 years of the city's history. My name is Jose Sueiro, and I came here and studied and became a roving leader. How many of you know what a roving leader is? I worked in drug and delinquency prevention in the nascent Hispanic community. I was director of the Latin American Youth Center, one of the first directors, and I ran newspapers in the city for 25 years until a very fine gentleman, and I can say it because the mayor, the ex-mayor is gone, I think is one of the greatest mayors we've ever had, Anthony Williams, plucked me out of my neighborhood and said, "You're gonna help me reform the city. I was a political appointee to Mayor Williams, and my expertise is going to be in the last 50 years of the city's existence and how this Hispanic community here has grown exponentially over these last 2 generations.
We're going to pause for the raffle.
Okay, everyone, going once, going twice. Look at the basket. That's it. Okay, so I'm going to have Jay close his eyes like this. And then you're going to pick one.
You're standing in the dark.
All right, what's the numbers? Who's the lucky winner?
1882269.
Oh, you do need this one.
Yes. Okay, so now we're going to move into our discussion phase. Having introduced themselves, the panelists are now going to start talking about our subject matter, which again is the tapestry of regional cultures in DC. So we're comparing and contrasting the experience of the federal government coming to DC in the 1790s with the experience of people who come to DC themselves recently. So to start things off, I'm going to ask this, well, I'll turn it over to Sandra, but we're going to begin with a historical look back by Matthew Gilmore at how DC was founded.
Right, thank you very much. So I want to set the stage for the federal government moving to the city in November of 1800. So we all know that the Congress passed the act establishing the Residence Act, establishing the city, and basically giving 10 years for it to be created, and giving George Washington the final say as to exactly where it would be located. And essentially, in my head, it's the inevitable place, because he had a choice of all these places along the Potomac, but this is the one that made the most sense. It's the head of navigation, so it's as far up as you could sail a ship, and and economic development was one of his big goals. So it was inevitable that it would end up here once he decided it was going to be on the Potomac. So this is what everybody saw. This is the picture of what the city was. And remember to think about it as Washington City. It's in the District of Columbia, but people are coming to Washington City. So I think you might just keep in mind what that might mean to them, whether they're a supporter or detractor of Washington. They're coming to Washington City, named after the great president. So what they actually saw, what was actually here, so this is a rendition based in part upon what Don Hawkins did, which you saw in the video. So what was actually here was not a nice, tidy, well laid out city. It was the start thereof. And yes, you did have cows and pigs, and you had orchards, you had all different kinds of things. The area covered was, well, I don't want to jump too far, but basically from Georgetown to the Navy Yard was 4 miles. And I marked in what buildings existed at the time, and so that's where people lived. And you can see they clustered around the White House, downtown, and the Navy Yard. Excellent. So in comparison, where they were coming from was Philadelphia. So now Philadelphia, this is not the same scale, because Philadelphia is 2 miles from river to river. And actually only half of it's developed. So it's a much smaller, more compact place, much more developed. So next slide. And so where they come from was Philadelphia. It was founded in 1682. So it has 100 years jump on Washington, D.C. So had 50,000 plus or minus people. The 2 miles from east to west. And I have to say 50,000 plus or minus because people kept getting killed by yellow fever, various fever epidemics, and at one point it killed about 10% of the people in the city. So that's the nation's capital. So is moving to Washington City a bad deal? Well, maybe not in some ways. You might live a little longer. So next slide. So then, again, this is showing you what they laid the city onto. So most of this has been smoothed out for us. We don't see this rough topography over 200 years. It's been smoothed out, but you can see some things they were interested in. So you've got essentially a tract, which is where Pennsylvania Avenue would be. You've got the President's House and the Capitol kind of put up on bluffs. You've got this creek running through the middle of it, which they were going to turn into a canal, which they did turn into a canal, and another creek, which they canalized as well. And you've got basically this topographical bowl. You've got those hills along the outside there, which basically are the northern boundary of the city. And again, bear in mind that's 4 miles from diagonally across. So then the district overall is an even much rougher topography. So, and this, when you think about development of the city, you really have to look at this to see what and why and where things develop. So this is just to give you an indication. So there were things going on out there, but not a lot. So we've got Georgetown and Alexandria as existing, and then we have basically those 3 nodes of development when people moved here from 1791 up into 1800. So next slide. So then I just did a little GIS magic to kind of turn it around so that you could see more, have a more friendly view. So again, you can see then the topography outside the city really was much rougher than we do see now. And so next slide. Okay. So that's Georgetown. So when people came, that's Georgetown waterfront. So this was a tobacco town, basically on the, not exactly cliffs, but on the bluffs over the Potomac. So again, as far north as you could sail on the Potomac. So basically you raise the tobacco in the hinterlands, you'd roll it down to the river, and you'd roll it down only as far as you had to go. So as far as up you could sail a ship, that's where you would build a town to collect the tobacco to go sail it off somewhere else. So this is kind of the Georgetown end. So then the next slide is that depiction from behind Georgetown. And yes, all those hills aren't really the way Washington D.C. actually was, but this gives you, again, an idealized view of how, again, this was being publicized. So you have to think about that as well. What was being publicized for public consumption. So next slide. I'm not sure he wants to be quoted, but I asked Don Hawkins about this, and I said, well, how would you describe Washington City in 1800? He said scruffy. But I just couldn't resist quoting him on that. So next slide. So then who came to Washington? Well, the whole government, which is only about 125, 126 staffers, employees. So then President Mrs. Adams moved down, and the 6th Congress convened here. And again, how many people is that? Not a lot. 32 senators, 105 congressmen. So the whole government moves here, and it's not even 300 people. So they're moving into this, pretty empty space, and there's not a lot of them, so they're going to be dispersed. The congressmen are going to live around Capitol Hill. The staffers are going to be probably closer to Georgetown. And then the district as a whole. District as a whole had 14,000 people. So that's mostly Georgetown and Alexandria. In the city, there were about 3,000 people, which I find pretty amazing considering what there was. And there were 362 buildings. They actually did an inventory to show the progress of construction, and there is a document that lists how many buildings in each square, and that's both frame and brick. So it's about 2/3 way frame to brick. And next slide. So yeah, here's a book, citation of books saying how many of these. So 253 frame and 84 brick. So next slide. And just because that's the list of all of them by square. So that's how that map is derived, by pulling all these out. And so then who else? Next slide. So who else was here? Well, there were things being built like the Octagon. The Peter family in Georgetown was there. The land itself and owned by the land for the whole city, and owned by 19 people. So before the government moved here, there really wasn't much going on at all. They had laid out some paper towns, but really it was those 19 people, and we can tell how much activity had happened because the deal with President Washington was basically 50-50 split. You get to keep half of your land, you give the rest of it to us, and that means as it gets developed, your land becomes more valuable. So they mapped all this. So there are maps for probably each proprietor, I'm not sure each one, but basically showing them this is the house, and they're interesting maps because it usually says there's a house and there's the graveyard. Like 3 of them at least have graveyards. And what had happened with the development of the city was a consortium, Greenleaf and Law, and Morris from Philadelphia had decided to try and corner the market on real estate in the city, build all these houses. It all collapsed. They didn't finish building hardly anything, so it was just a disaster. Next slide. And what some of the proprietors had wasn't really fancy either. So this is Davy Burns' cottage. So it's where the Pan American, the OAH building is now. This was his house. So he was one of the 19 proprietors. So it's nothing fancy going on. So, and next slide. So, like I said, not much else going on. There were the never developed towns. So Carrollsburg was down in southeast, and Hamburg was in Foggy Bottom. And there were a few houses built, but really not much. And so then, too far, go back. So, no, backwards, one more back. So to get the information on this, there's hundreds and hundreds of books. But I decided just to pull a few. So one is this new one by Tom Lewis. Now, I'm not plugging it just because I've met him, but it's an interesting take on the move to Washington. It deals with Margaret Bayard Smith, who was wife of the publisher of the major newspaper, and she did a book on the first 40 years of Washington society. So it has an interesting take, because the other book that's out there that I neglected to mention was called City of Mud. And the issue with City of Mud is it presents the critiques of Washington, and not in a very balanced way. And yes, Washington, D.C. was muddy and dusty with the rain. Certain seasons, dry weather in summer, but every city was muddy. So there wasn't really a context for that. And the thing people don't realize is as soon as you start to pave things, you want to get rid of the mud. As soon as you start to pave them, paving starts to fall apart. So maintenance of pavement is really prohibitively expensive in some place like Washington for decades. The other resource I wanted to point out is an issue of Washington history, double issue we did way back in 2000 that has all these articles, including Don Hawkins, on Washington in 1800. which is a great resource and is available online. And that is me setting the stage for people coming to Washington.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Now let's talk a little bit about the people that we didn't talk about who came, as we're going to have everyone make a contribution about those first 20 years and how it set the stage for what Washington was to become in that early year. So we know that when the congressmen came, they brought enslaved individuals with them. So we see that that population in that first 20 years is being planted. So we're comparing people coming now, so we can look at some tensions. Everyone wasn't happy that they left Philadelphia. Everyone wasn't happy that they came to Washington. And even we see now that there is that kind of conflict when individuals come, there is some pushback. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening in terms of how we see our communities being established in that early 20 year, growing out of that, an African American community, a society, a political community, and what we're seeing now.
All right, so I'm going to jump ahead 220 years, and so I talked to all these students who come for the very first time. Most of them have never been to Washington, and among the things I do I have it here? I ask them to just give me a short description of some TV show that they know, and just give quickly about Washington. And I always print them out. This is from last term. These are the nice adjectives they came up with: love affairs, important history, adventure. This isn't describing shows and movies that they're familiar with. That's all the adjectives they came up with that were nice. Not so nice, a lot more. Corrupt, lied, manipulative, ruthless, plotting, evil, conniving, immoral, power hungry, will do anything. That's the impression a lot of people have of Washington now. And I guess what I'd like to add to this is how fundamentally different it is from what Matthew was talking about. As a journalist, you always want to find these common links and say, no, really, it's not that different. It is that different. And some of the fundamental things that Matthew was talking about, when students arrive, the one thing that they first talk about is the history. There was no history at that point. Georgetown had a few years' history. Alexandria had been around since 1749 or something. There was no history. I love, the students are absolutely fascinated. We are on Scott Circle. And I love telling them the story about Winfield Scott, who's right across the street, just down from DuPont Circle. Winfield Scott, that statue went up in the 1880s. If you remember the name Old Fuss and Feathers, that was Winfield Scott. He was in the War of 1812. He also ran for president, part of the Whig Party, and he was the first commander for the Union Army in the Civil War. So he had a huge, long career. So by the time they made the statue of him, he was an old man, and they actually had people sit on horses, and they sculpted them. They put him on a little mare because he was a little fragile. And when they put that statue exactly where it is now, the family was outraged because it was humiliating for him to be on a little tiny mare, female horse, a humiliation. So they literally took sculpted male horse parts and put them on the horse. So now he is sitting on a small stallion, which is great for the University of California to say you're across the street from the only statue in town that had the sex change operation, which is absolutely the case. But there's a history here now which defines this place, which would have been completely absent back then, because Matthew points out these were all pioneers. The other thing students always point out to me is the racial mix, which is very different from California. Talk bluntly in racial terms, if you look at the percentage of white people, California and DC, very, very similar. 36, 39%, it goes up and down, very similar. But the racial mix of the ethnic groups, very, very different. California is about 7% African American. And the one thing that students talk about when they come out here, and a lot of them are Latinos who say this, is they are not used to seeing African Americans, they're used to seeing Latinos in service jobs. That's just what they see in California. And they express how it's a shock. And they also express with shock at the middle class and working class African Americans, which they're not used to. You're a alum of Howard University. When students go to Howard, and again, this is a sensitive thing to say, they are blown away, especially the African American students, but all of them, because when they are used to in California, and I think it's true for a lot of America, seeing a large African American community, it's very often a poor neighborhood. It's a crime-ridden, poor neighborhood. People come to Washington, D.C., and suddenly they not only see middle class, they see upper middle class African-American neighborhoods, and then they get to Howard, and they see this academic community with people like interns walking around just out of medical school, and it's all African-American, mostly African-American, and it's eye-opening for a lot of these students. Another thing, I had class today, and I said, hey, what are your impressions? I'm going to talk to this group. Somebody said, oh, well, we're really impressed at the cleanliness of the city, which is certainly more true around Scott Circle than it is in other parts of the city. But as Matthew points out, that's nothing that anybody would have talked about back then. The muddy, dirty streets. So if there's anything that does tie it together, maybe, and I don't know because 220 years ago is out of my realm, it's the sense of excitement and opportunity. When these students get here, why do they leave the beauty of California and the mountains and the ocean and the food and the weather? It's because there are exciting things in Washington. It is the seat of federal government, and that opens up incredible opportunities. Some of them get out here, like me, and then fall in love with the local city. But that's not why most of the people who I deal with, and a lot of people you deal with, come out here. In California, you're much more likely to have native-born people or people who move there because they like the weather, they like to surf. Here, at least in the little inside circle between, say, Capitol Hill and K Street, and most people you meet there are in Washington because of their jobs, their spouse's jobs, or somebody's job. And that's a very single-minded, narrow focus. That would have been true to a certain extent, when Matthew talks about it. I mean, these people were coming here because it was the federal government. And actually, go back to that racial mix for a second. The racial mix, and correct me if I'm wrong, it would have been very similar here to Philadelphia. There were slaves here, there were also free blacks here, but it was a black and white community, which is not necessarily all that different than it would from Philadelphia. My students complain bitterly that there's no place they can find Mexican food, which I'm sure was not different back then. I mean, there weren't even Mexicans I can't imagine there were Mexicans in D.C. So it's a completely different experience. The only thing I can think of that really binds it is this idea that it is the seat of the government, and that creates a lot of opportunity.
Well, actually, I'm kind of at the other end of the spectrum. I'm going to talk about the newest members of this community. But just to put a little bit more context in this, what Mark was describing, certainly the national city, the people that came to Capitol Hill, the people that came to work at the different administrations, even back in the 1800s, that this when I got here, which was the 60s, this was a predominantly African-American town, and that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the national, or even at this point, the international part of the city. My town, my Washington, D.C. is the town part. I don't know how many of you have read Dream City, but Dream City, written by Harry Jaffe and Tom Sherwood, it talks about the alley cultures, how in the 1940s, many of you probably remember people worked in the printing office, in government printing office, and the alleys in Washington were the focus points of black culture. They were the back of the houses, and there was these vibrant, there would be cooking and singing and partying, so that's my town. When we got here, it was an African-American town, Chocolate City and all of that. It was predominantly, when I got here, it must have been roughly 65% African-American. Now, what happened with us? In the Census Bureau in 1960 said that in the Washington metropolitan area, there were less than 10,000 Spanish-speaking people. That's the way they were described by the census. That's 1960. 50 years later, 2 generations, the census in 2010 claims that there were 790,000 Hispanics, Latinos, to use their term. In 2 generations, over 750,000 people migrated, and we believe it's much more. We believe it's about 1 million. 1 of every 6 people in the Washington metropolitan area is a Latino or Hispanic. And yet, the first bodega, the first market for Spanish food, opened up in 1934. It was called Casa Pena on 17th and R. Adelina Callahan, who was the daughter of the owners, then subsequently became the owner of La Fonda en el Bodegón at the corner of 17th and R, and she became president of the Washington, D.C. Restaurant Association. Bless her heart, she's still alive. Ana Sol Gutierrez, who is running for the 8th District Congress in the 8th District of Maryland, her father came here in 1948 to establish, he is one of the signers. The UN established the Inter-American Development Bank, and all of those protocols, he represented El Salvador in 1948. Ana Sol Gutierrez has been here since that time, and she's now running for Congress in the 8th District of Maryland. Sacred Heart on 16th Street, right by Park Road, there is a Dominican woman by the name of Juana Campos and her daughter Carmen Torruella Quander, and the African American community will know the Quanders. Paul Quander was a deputy mayor, and the Quanders are a very prominent black family here. Well, those Dominicans created Sagrado Corazon, which is Sacred Heart, which was the first church that did, they did misas. I'm losing my English. In Spanish. And so I'm just trying to give you some markers as to how we came here. This Hispanic community is very, very unique. It is one of the most recent migrations inside the United States. You can actually track it from when it started. A guy by the name of Charles Lane did a magazine piece in Regardes. Charles Lane, by the way, is now the editor of Newsweek, or was the editor of Newsweek till very recently, and he's a high-ranking journalist at the Washington Post. He wrote this wonderful story about this one man that lived on Hobart Street in Mount Pleasant that brought 5,000 Salvadorans from his hometown in Intipucá, El Salvador. And Intipucá, El Salvador is way tucked into the mountains of western, because El Salvador is east to west, and it is surrounded by poverty, and yet you turn in the road and you have this beautifully paved road, this wonderfully built out city with all kinds of animals, etc., and they all live on the money that is telegrammed to them, that is sent from here, and it's one of these oases of prosperity in a very poor place. So in the 70s, Salvadorans, and then in the late 70s, there were the wars in Central America, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Honduras, which is still a very violent place, and El Salvador. Between the years of 1978 to about 1990, easily 500,000 Latinos from Central America settled in Washington, D.C. I'm not only talking about Central America, the dictatorships in Chile, in Argentina, in Uruguay. So there was an enormous influx of political refugees from Latin America. So this community, the community that I work with and represent, I was a Spanish language newspaper publisher for 25 years. So I got to know the community very, very well, and I got to help the small business sector grow. My classified section supported me, and the advertisements for the small, the restaurants and the cleaning services and the real estate and all of those things I watched as the economic development. This Central American community, this Salvadoran community, is a very, very very hardworking, very diligent people who take enormous risks. You already take enormous risks if you emigrate, if you're an immigrant. But these folks, I mean, they took over the Hispanics in town are concentrated, one, in the cleaning industry, the cleaning offices, and just in general house cleaning stuff, and babysitting and nannies and like that. The restaurant industry. There's an affordable building I worked with Jair Lynch on 1111 Mass Ave. It is 167 units and it's 80% Salvadoran Mexican. They're all waiters and busboys on 14th Street. I used to tease that if they went on strike, the restaurants couldn't open on 14th Street because there was all of these folks living right there. And also construction. I'm a managing director. I'm on the board of directors. I'm managing director of DC Hispanic Contractors Association, and it's remarkable to me how Hispanics are a very significant part of that sector. So that's what's happened to us. As I said, we're now like 1 in 6 in the entire population, in the regional population, and I just wanted to point out that a comment I made to you is that I had lunch with, I think it was Karen Rose. It's the woman that created the documentary about Marion Barry that HBO put on. By the way, if it wasn't for Marion Barry, this Latino community loved Marion Barry. Marion Barry, he was one of the most progressive, our small companies, hiring in the city government. He was, all throughout his life, from beginning to end, the Hispanic community adored Marion Barry. He opened doors for us. He allowed us to participate and be integrated. But this woman said to me, she said, when I researched that documentary, I couldn't find a lot about the history in the last 50 to 100 years. And I was talking to Sandra, and I was saying that we really need to document what's gone on. And it's a very transient city. This town I'm talking about, this African-American town, is really the permanent part. All of that national and international and all of that downtown stuff is very transient. Nobody puts roots down. And those of us that have, very little is known about us.
It is impossible to talk for 3 to 5 minutes about something that, and I understand about something you're passionate about, especially when you're talking about Washington, D.C., which is so unique. I'm not surprised that your students have the negative things to say about the city, because it is a schizophrenic place. It is the nation's capital, but it's also neighborhoods, it's also people. But what people know is the nation's capital, and it's rare that they know about the city. So there is that surprise that there's a robust African-American, well-educated, well-to-do community. Just like there's community that's not that well-to-do, there is a mix. But people don't know a lot about that. The newer arrivals that are coming that have done and struggled and made a mark here are more, it's a better known history than that of individuals who have been here for so long. Many people came to Washington of color because of that community, because of Howard University, because of the ability to be in positions of power and authority and to have an educated cultural environment where it was not rare, where you were not one of, where you were not unique. And it has fostered a diaspora of individuals who have gone out from here all across the world internationally, where you, if you are a Howard-ier, you can go anywhere in the world and find someone who can say HU, represent, and who can talk about Howard University and what that meant, not only as an institution, but as a landmark in the city, as grounding a city, and as first fostering and nurturing a community that even still does that. So when you're in Washington, you have to realize that there are people who have no idea about Rock Creek Park, about Upper Northwest, about Northeast, about Michigan Park, about Petworth, who don't know those places, who don't know those families who have been there for years and years and educated and raised their children and paid their taxes and done all of that. So you hear these things about Washington, but you know people only know the surface Washington, know nothing but the monuments, and those, you know, that all of those videos are very nice, but that's nothing about the people. And so when we talk about Washington, we have to have two conversations. And we have to be sure that we're very inclusive in those conversations. So to hear the passion that Jose has is important, because when you win the sterile conversations about manipulative and lies and scandalous and power-loving, that's not the Washington that 90% of us know. We certainly understand what's going on, but that's not talking about the schools, that's not talking about the houses, that's not talking about Dr. Elizabeth Clark Lewis's book, Living In, Living Out, and about domestics and penny savers and people who saved and worked and struggled to make this community. So you have this pushback, and even in the 18th and 19th century, when people were being brought here against their will, and people who had the opportunity to see an advancement, because if you were enslaved in Maryland, enslaved in Virginia, the fact that you were building this new place gave you an opportunity to, if you had an owner who allowed you to work and save some money, made it possible for you to manumute yourself, or made it possible for you to buy your freedom, made it possible for you to have an opportunity to expand and to do something different. So it served a greater purpose. What is so sad now is that people know the capital and know the power structure, and they still don't know the neighborhoods. And as a historian, and those of you who are scholars, whether you have a degree or no degree, and you know your history, it's important to document it. It's important to have oral histories. So those individuals that we're losing, that story can be told, it can be documented. So when you're in your families and you've got Madeir and Grandmama and Auntie and individuals who are in 4th or 5th generations, it's important to talk to them and document that. So all people don't know are manipulative and lies and crimes and protests and death. They know the positive things that are here. So these kind of gatherings are important to have a wider conversation about the history. And you need to know it, and you need to understand that when it started, no one had any idea that we'd be having a conversation with the former mayor talking about statehood and voting. No idea. They had no clue, and they didn't plan it that way. But it has grown past that. They never planned for there to be this Washington, D.C., where there were African Americans, when people are surprised that they have coats and their doctors and their lawyers and their judges. So now we have to have a different kind of conversation.
Well, I was going to say that two things. One, a useful resource for this kind of discussion is this book, Washington Odyssey. It originally was published as Urban Odyssey, and it does cover kind of the flow of different ethnicities through Washington, D.C. And as far as I know, it's the only one. And Elizabeth Clark Lewis has a piece in it. And what I was going to say was the town, when the federal employees arrived, was, surprisingly, probably to most of you, it was an Irish town. By the 1830s, half of the population of Washington, D.C. was reported to be Irish. So it was Irish workers and free and enslaved African Americans who built the city. And the Irish tradition is, basically kind of gone away, but there are distinguishing things. The first Catholic church in the city was St. Patrick's, of course, Irish. The first murderer executed in the city was William McGurk, Irish. So they made their mark in the city in various ways. And they, kind of condensed at some point, an odd kind of metaphor, into the neighborhood called Swampoodle, North Capitol and K and H Street. So that's one piece of history that's, a little bit hard to recreate. But it is important to know that things have flowed over time.
I just want to add that Washington's very special to all of us. We all lived here, so I was born here. But the reason it is important to the rest of the country isn't because of the town part. I'm not saying the town part isn't absolutely wonderful, but that's why the world looks to Washington, which even as when you were talking about how people don't know about some of the communities here, there are, and it's a very awkward thing for me because I can't recruit African American students on UC campuses by saying this, but there are African American parents who tell their kids, in Los Angeles and in Fresno and in Oakland, you got to go spend a term in Washington because you've never seen anything like this before. And it's important that you see a vibrant African American community. It's because Washington is on a pedestal because of the national stage it's on. And it's one of the things I think we all agree is one of the great frustrations with what the former mayor was saying, and one of the great frustrations even with the president for not being able to make this a national model of prosperity, because then the world would look in and see all of that. Because what we don't want to have is, we don't want to become like the show, we don't want to become like The Wire. You know, we don't want to be treated like Baltimore. Washington and Baltimore doesn't want to be treated as it's treated on national television. But the reason people pay attention to us is because of the things that feed into the national model, and it gives the town an opportunity to shine.
Jay is asking now that we have time for questions. So, Jay, you want the mic so the participant, okay. And I have to say, I'm married to a native Washingtonian, and he's instructed me, it's been 16 years, whenever I meet a native Washingtonian, I have to ask what high school you went to. So before you leave, I'll come around and get high schools to give him.
Good evening, and thank you. My name is Helen Compton Harris, and I'm a native Washingtonian, and I go back many generations, maybe 7. So my question is, what happened to the Native American representation? Because prior to African Americans, Irish, whomever getting here, there was a Native American population. And so I feel that that has not been addressed tonight. And so I was wondering if you could address it now.
And what you may want to, what may well be in place is that there is the same thing with the, what we're talking about, a contemporary African American history on individuals that we talked about earlier, that you don't have that written. You don't have that 18th and 19th century presence here written. And if you're looking for a lot of the scholarship on that, many times it's just not there. One of the things that's encouraging about scholars coming out and writing and new ideas and new things opening up is that you may have someone who is writing on the early presence of Native Americans here. But I haven't, and I'm not saying there isn't there, that's not my area of expertise, but I have not even come across anyone who's talked about that kind of scholarship in the area here in the District of Columbia in the 18th century. I'm not saying it's not there, but it would be interesting. I may just give my students an assignment to see if they can find something, and I'll let you know. What high school did you go to?
Also your LinkedIn friend.
Oh, okay.
Well, the first chapter in here does address Native Americans in the Mid-Atlantic region. And so it states or implies that the settlement was was thinly settled, and so there were probably no Native Americans here when Georgetown was founded.
I understand you have to look, because many times marginalized groups, that history, you have to look for it. I work in the area of African American deafness, and in 1857, when Kendall School was started, there were African American and white deaf children here in the District of Columbia going to school. By 1905, after Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, a black deaf child in Washington, D.C. by law had to physically leave the city to be educated, and that lasted until 1905, Miller versus D.C. Board of Education. So there's a lot of history here in Washington, D.C. that most people do not know about. Now, Gallaudet University now is one of the only 2 institutions in the country that are for deaf and hard of hearing people. Gallaudet is the liberal arts, and National Technical Institute for the Deaf in Rochester, where our daughter went, is the, I want to say mechanical, but that's not, I can't think of the term. One is liberal arts and one is vocation, thank you. So those are the only 2 institutions, but many people, even Native Washingtonians, don't know the history of that institution here in the city. And that was a pre-Brown case that brought black deaf children who were resident in the district back into the district to be educated. It was a segregated educational system at that time, but you know, they were here and were the only group of people in the city. Black children went to separate schools and white children went to separate schools, but nobody who was hearing and of color was put out of the city by the Act of March 1905. So I mean, there's so much history that people don't know about here, so when the world looks at us, they don't know that either. So there's still a lot of work to be done and a lot of things to be written. So these Humanitinis are really more and more important for that as well.
I just wanted to talk about the Indians. I live in Missouri. And so the Anacostia River is, I understand, was named after a tribe. And also you will see, if you look in some of the books at Dr. King Library, where they've had the teepees along the Anacostia River, down the area where Barry Farms is today. So they do have some history, just not documented, as you mentioned.
And which becomes the problem, because if it's not written, you know, that's part. So there's still so much to do. So for those of you who are authors, for those of you who are historians, I mean, there's so much to be written about here in the district still, that, you know, there's work to be done.
Before we move on to the next question, and I'll bring the microphone to you, wanted to just plug something which I neglected to do at the beginning. A Humanitini is actually a drink as well as an event. And they're serving them here. It tastes great. So I just want to encourage you all to consider ordering a Humanitini while you're at the Humanitini.
Thank you. Recently, just 1 week new to the city, can you kindly tell me what the population of the city is and break it down by ethnic category?
The census estimate right now, 2016, 659,000. It's probably a little less than that, but it has grown immensely. It was like 100,000 less just 10 years ago. But the breakdown, it's roughly 50% African American. The African American population in the city has been decreasing steadily. It's somewhere around 50%, and the white population has grown. In the city, the Latino population in the city has stayed roughly the same. It's roughly 12%. We calculate 72 to 75,000, which is like a ward. So, you know, about 36 and 12, 48, and the rest African American. There's, you know, they count, I think, the Asian population, which is very small, 4 to 6%. But those are roughly the numbers. This is still an African American town. But there was something I wanted to point out that's very serious. We were talking about the beginnings and the way the Irish are no longer here in those numbers. The Indians are obviously no longer here. I fear for my town. I've been an affordable housing activist for 25 years. I live in a rent-controlled building in Adams Morgan and pay a little bit less than $900 a month, which is incredible. But what's happening in this town is the developers have won. This town is being taken over. And what that means is that there's this enormous turnover. I don't begrudge and belittle kids that are graduating from college. They want to come here and make a name for themselves in politics, but these aren't the people, these aren't my town. These aren't the people that are staying here. The people that are staying here are getting bought out every day. And in my building, half of the people in my building, you know, they move out every 9 months. There's no community, no sense of community. And this has happened all over the place. Wait for it, Anacostia. Wait for it, because the section of this city that is getting most developed now and gentrified, that horrible word, is Anacostia. Everybody's buying in Anacostia, and everybody is waiting for Anacostia to flip. So I'm sorry I went off on that one, but that, for me, I'm very passionate about that too, because the reason we don't have enough traditions, the reason they don't talk about our history, you know, I wanted to talk about the lady used to live up in Meridian House when Duke Ellington was on U Street. Do you remember that? And it's LaDroit Park. This is LaDroit Park, and then there used to be a madam who had a brothel up on the bluff just above U Street, and you know, Duke Ellington and you know, all of the big band sounds in the 30s and 40s. There was an enormous nightlife at LaDroit. Even when I worked for the mayor, I mean, LaDroit has a history of having these very ornate, very beautiful houses of the evening, you know. None of that is held on to. None of that percolates in this town because it's too transient. We need to hold on to our traditions and to our histories and to the people, the working people who make this city.
One of the, I only sometimes stop people when they say none of it, and I understand what you're saying, and you're making a point. But there are so many families who are holding on to those traditions, who are at the same church, who are at, you know, Shiloh Baptist is 152 years old, Shiloh in the house, Metropolitan, where people are still doing that, where there are still the clubs, there's still the social gatherings, but we don't know a lot of that because that's going on in the neighborhoods and in the houses where people aren't talking about it. I had a student in class who said to me, Dr. Jowers, why do people think we didn't want a Chipotle or a Best Buy or a Target where we lived? You know, everybody, you know, and I'm not saying that, I know the dangers that happen with gentrification, but, you know, there are some positive things. He said, we've owned our house forever, so why do people think we didn't want to be able to walk to the store and buy something? Why did people think we didn't want to be able to not have to get in a car and drive to Maryland to have a sit-down restaurant? Why do people think we weren't able to have something nice in our section? Why do people think that? Why do, you know, and there's a whole controversy about Walmart. I'm not defending anything, but you walk in your neighborhood, people are working. Why do they think we didn't want those jobs where people get in the car, they go to Walmart? So, you know, so there's that part of it as well. There's the whole class system thing in the elephant in the room that we haven't talked about here in the District of Columbia. So there are those individuals who are very well positioned to take advantage of gentrification, who have owned their homes for years and wanted to sell and move to Rocky Mount or wherever and bought land, build a home, come back and visit the kids and having a great time. So I just don't want us to think that everybody's beaten down and everybody in the district, especially in the African American community, didn't take advantage or aren't able to enjoy some of these things, because many people held on, stayed in those communities, and now are enjoying the benefits, even as they understand what's happening to those individuals who rented and did not own. So it's sort of a dichotomy. It's that dualness that W. Du Bois talked about. Now we're talking about a different kind of dualness. So what happens when you are well-to-do, you've held on, you saved your money, you bought your house, and now you're able to enjoy gentrification where your neighbor across the street cannot? How do you feel about that? I mean, so we're talking about still being, you know, in a position where if you are of color and you can't have that conversation about how horrible gentrification was because you own 3 or 4 properties, bought them for $100,000, flipped them, sold them for $590,000, and now you're sitting pretty. But your students come and they see manipulative, scandalous, and ugly and all that stuff, and no one even sees the fact that there's this vibrant community that can talk about their history and their culture, and their mother went to Howard, and their grandmother went to Howard, and their great-grandmother was a principal, and all of these things. So it's that dichotomy that we have to deal with, and people have to understand that it's so many layers when you talk about Washington, D.C. It's not just here and there. There's all of that in between. I have a good friend, Sandra Butler Truesdale, 4th generation Washingtonian, who can go back and talk about all of the historical things that people won't even know. Your students would be blown away. And many of my students are blown away about these things. They say, there's nothing historical in my neighborhood. I live in Southeast, I live in Northwest, I live in Northeast. And I say, do you know Nanny Helen Burroughs? There are plenty of things that you need to go look at, but many times we don't talk about these things. We don't talk about the history. We don't talk about pre-Brown education and going to schools where you may not have had the same books, but you certainly had teachers with PhDs and MAs who taught you on a level up here and expected you to rise and didn't care whether your book was old and ugly and torn or written. They taught you well. I'm writing a book now, and I spent last summer interviewing about 30 individuals, late 70s and into their mid 90s. And they were talking about going to school in Washington, D.C. in a pre-Brown era, and then I interviewed those who went in a post-Brown era. And the thread through everything, even when they talked about getting textbooks from white schools where they had written all these ugly, horrible things in, they talked about the fact that the education they got was stellar. They were expected to excel. No one had an excuse about a school being poor or not having enough. They were just taught by professionals who loved what they did, knew the value of education and the movement that came with that, and the importance of it to a person. Even though they talked about other class issues as well, but to a person, there was not one who felt that they had an education that was inferior because they were in a school that was black. Not one. So there's that kind of history that people, when you talk about pre-Brown, everyone thinks, oh, it was so horrible, and they just, yes, of course, segregation was horrible. But we have individuals who have a history of rising and of having excellence no matter what the situation was. And that's what these individuals are talking about. So those are the kind of things that we also want to make known. My book will be done this year, my book will be done this year, my book will be done this year. So if you see me on the street, feel free to ask me. But we have to document and make known those kind of stories as well. Jay, I think we have a question over here.
Yes. Unfortunately, we're supposed to end at 8:30. So any other questions you have, don't lose them. Just come up and talk to the panelists in person afterwards.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you said, and I think a lot of people are aware of that tradition. I'm just trying to thinking about the national conversation that we're having now around the election, and that these issues have become less race defined and more class defined. And I understand what you're saying, but what I'd like to ask is, if you run the numbers, what's the percentage of the African Americans in these neighborhoods that own their homes and they're sitting pretty compared to those that didn't own their homes and have been pushed out? And I would say, I don't know the answer. You may know it. I don't.
No, I don't know exactly, but what I would say is that I agree with you about the class situation. That's really the big elephant in the room. And when you run the numbers, it's going to depend on the wards that you run the numbers in. This has been done, and I have seen this. I think City Paper did a section one time, ward by ward, the percentage of people who were homeowners, the percentage of people who had college degrees, and they broke it down by race and gender and all of that. And the wards are the wards that you would think were the wards, 2, 3, 4. The wards that you would think were lesser wards, 7, 8. So it definitely is a class situation. And I said that earlier. There are individuals who do own their homes and are able to enjoy this, and there are far too many who do not. And it runs across all racial lines. There are far too many communities where people just were not able to buy. For many people of color, there was the whole thing that banks wouldn't lend, which is why Independence Bank and all these black banks came and industrial were established, because they couldn't get loans to buy their homes. So for many people, it was a systemic embedded racism that allowed them to be in a position where they didn't own the homes, or if they owned them, couldn't fix them up. So yeah, you're right, the whole class piece has even taken over race, I would say.
It's an awkward conversation to have, obviously. I just want to quickly say, as we talk about the wards, there's one statistic which I just looked up. Ward 3 and Ward 8 each have in the high 70,000s. They're about, Ward 3 is a little bit smaller, I believe. If you look at the food stamps, there are 611 people in Ward 3 on food stamps. There are 44,000 people in Ward 8 on food stamps. How can you possibly explain that? And then you look at the racial numbers, and of course the races, and this is why I say it's an awkward conversation, because of course there are people, of course class is, I think, the ultimate answer in it, but when students, one of the things they notice when they're out here, places like Oakland, California, where still overwhelmingly the rich people in the hills tend to be white, and the poor people in the flats tend to be African American, but it's more integrated than this place is. This is more of a checkerboard city, where there's black and white, and here's like you get uncomfortable. I can't see all that well here. Even this crowd tonight. And of course, I mean, I'm not saying that people don't get along black and white, but even this crowd tonight sort of separates itself a little bit. White people are a little over there, and the black people are a little more over there. But exactly, and I'm saying that something is, and that hasn't changed. In 220 years ago, African Americans were either brought to this place as slaves or they were free blacks. Being a free black was a lot better than being a slave, but it sucked. It was horrible. And that hasn't changed in 220 years, the segregation between what was then white and black and now is many other races. And I'd love for somebody to talk to me about how you can possibly change that, because I don't know if we can deal with the class issue until we deal with that.
Okay, I need to end on a question, because that's the last time we have. I want to thank the panelists for coming tonight. And remind you that there are, again, 11 more of these. We'd like for you to attend as many of them as you possibly can. Thank you all for coming tonight.